Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me for today's event. I'm Scott Storey, Head of UK Operations for OpusXenta, and my role today is to facilitate our webinar, The Climate Emergency: What Changes Can Crematoria, Funeral Directors and Cemeteries Make to Protect the Environment? We've got around half an hour of information to share with you today, after which we'll have some additional time to take questions. As we go through today, please do add any questions that come to mind in the QA section, which you can access from the button towards the bottom of your screen. You can also chat with us and your fellow attendees via the chat button or window. I have some colleagues online with me today as well who will be monitoring that chat area, so if you have any issues at all, please let us know in the chat and we'll try and assist. Finally, as is the case with all of our webinars, today's event is being recorded, and we'll make that recording available to everyone who registered or attended within the next few days. So our panelists for today's webinar include Brendon Day. Brendon is Secretary and Executive Officer of the Federation of Burial and Cremation Authorities. The FBCA represents 80% of crematoria across the UK, along with cemeteries. Previously, Brendon worked in local authorities for 37 years, managing cemeteries, crematoria, coroners, registrars and other services. Brendon is also a director of Cameo, the only national mercury abatement scheme in the UK, and is a fellow of the Institute of Cemetery and Crematorium Management, where he has held several senior positions. We're also joined by Philip Peacock. Philip has spent for 30 years, his career has been with BT in various roles, ultimately joining BT Legal. During this period, Philip was an elected parish councillor in his home Cambridgeshire village. He served as a councillor for 24 years, of which 14 were as chairman. Philip joined Huntingdon Town Council as Deputy Town Clerk in 2013, and in 2014 as Town Clerk. He's a member of the Society of Local Council Clerks and is the chairman of the Cambridgeshire branch. He's currently president-elect of the SLCC and is due to take office as president in October 2021. And finally, David Collingwood, a qualified funeral director and embalmer. David has spent his lifetime in funerals, the last 32 years with Co-op Funeral Care in executive roles as operations director and latterly as director of funerals. He also represented Co-op Funeral Care as a member of the NAFD executive. So, with a significant number of local authorities declaring a climate emergency, we can see that there are aggressive timelines and plans being put into place to address all areas under their control. A lot of these plans are being implemented by 2030. Every aspect of our local community needs to be reviewed, considered and measured as part of the climate emergency plan. So not only do we need to identify and address the issues, we need to change our outlook and consider our environment in whatever activities are undertaken. This is a fundamental cultural change in our daily lives. So where do bereavement services fit in? I'm just going to highlight a couple of examples before I hand over to our panel. So let's take a look at the most well-known topic of CO2 emissions. The majority of cremators in use in the UK are efficient gas cremators. Assuming nothing at all was done to deal with CO2 emissions from cremations in the UK, it's estimated that we would need to plant 1 million trees a year. So simply offsetting is not a practical solution. We need to review current activities and identify ways in which CO2 emissions can be reduced with the current equipment in service. Some operators are starting to use electric cremators, thereby reducing emissions through the use of greener energy. Or should we consider alternatives to cremation, such as resomation, cremation, or composting? But it's not just CO2 emissions that we need to consider. Current figures from the government suggest that the average Nox emissions for the mix of cars on our road is 0.137 grams per kilometre. Nox is not only generated from vehicle emissions. Chemical Nox results from the embalming process and coffin construction, and thermal Nox comes from the process of combustion. So a single cremation generates Nox emissions equivalent to a car travelling 2,280 miles. Collectively, Nox emissions created as a result of all cremations in the UK is the equivalent of a car travelling 1.7 billion kilometres, the distance from the Sun to beyond Saturn, every year. These are just a few examples of the challenges faced. So, whether you operate a crematorium, manage a cemetery, or manage the funeral arrangements, there is a direct impact on the environment. And there are some fundamental elements that need to be given consideration. The materials that are used in and around our services, for example. What materials are used in coffin construction or embalming or memorial markers or headstones? Recycling, not just plastics, but what about rainwater harvesting or floral tributes or renewable energy sources? The biodiversity of our memorial gardens and cemeteries. Are our grounds managed to promote local flora, fauna and wildlife? Emissions created as part of bereavement services, regardless of whether that is burial or cremation, and how modern technology can help with family engagement or online operational services or ground staff management, delivering virtual services or digital memorials, or the use of on-premise smart technology or electric vehicles and charging points. These are just some examples. I'm sure there are many, many more. So now let me hand over to Brendon Day from the FBCA to talk about these challenges in more detail. Brendon.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for that introduction, Scott. And can I also take this opportunity to thank our partners, OpusXenta, for agreeing to host this series of webinars on the environment, the next one of which is on the 17th of March, so put it in your diary. I should also like to thank Scott for those slides. So I think it can be difficult at times just to realise that we can be part of the problem. I think there's a tendency everybody to think that it's somebody else's issue. And I've just seen an alert come through from Sky that Ford are announcing their complete range of cars are going to be electric by the end of the decade. Again, so they're moving forward. And I think we also have to move forward as well, because the examples which Scott has just shown in car miles and trees planted, shows that whilst individually we may not cause a great deal of a problem, but as a sector, we do have a significant negative impact. But I think on a positive note, if we all work together as a sector, we can also be a powerful force for good. And I think that's going to be the key. It's going to be reaching out to each other and seeing what we can do working together. So I think there's 4 key drivers for me, which mean that we have to do something. And those 4 disruptors, which are set out there, start with public opinion. Now, the environmental movement can be traced back to the 1960s, but in recent years, the increasing scientific evidence of damage to the environment, media exposure, and programs such as the Blue Planet have all caught the imagination of the public, creating a desire for change. And that desire we can see, I think, quite easily through being expressed through their consumer habits, because customer choice is now growing. In a recent report by Deloitte, How Consumer Behaviour is Embracing Sustainability, found that 43% of consumers are already actively choosing brands due to their environmental values. And that will impact on our sector, just as it's impacted on other sectors. And of course, the politicians will seek to reflect the views of the public in the policies they put forward. And that will result in legislation. And we can see that there's going to be an ever expanding amount of direct and indirect legislation, which will have an impact on our sector. Directly, I think those obviously managed or do manage crematoria today can expect the process guidance note that we have to work to being reviewed. It's long overdue, and we feel it may be later this year, and Nox could be included. I think that's a good example of direct legislation. But there's also indirect legislation, such as greening aviation and shipping. If shipping is going to be impacted with carbon taxes, again, that could impact the cost of the granite memorials coming from China and India. But I don't think there's any doubt this legislation is really just around the corner. And of course, where the legislation consumers go, then investors and investment follow. And that'll be the same, whether it's the private sector or the public sector. Because in the private sector, they will need to satisfy their shareholders, and in the public sector, it will be a need to satisfy their local voters. But whether it's private or public, I think there's going to be a growth and a boom in that green economy. And I think everyone really can see opportunities there, and we need to be able to take them. And Sport Federation members meet these challenges. The executive took some key decisions at its meeting on the 19th of October 2020. In particular, the executive recognised that they needed to respond proactively to the global emergency through supporting our Federation members to respond, and doing so on both a strategic and an operational level. On a strategic level, the Federation will reach out to like-minded organisations. Working together, we can achieve far more. I think there's no doubt about that. And I'm really looking forward to working with funeral directors, memorial masons, florists, cremator manufacturers. We've all got a role to play in this. And a particular example being the development of the Environmental Stewardship Group with the Institute of Cemetery and Crematorium Management, the Cremation Society, and the CDS Group, who have been instrumental and incredibly supportive in facilitating all of us working together to look at environmental issues in our sector. Now, the Environmental Stewardship Group will be launched on the 1st of March, and our next webinar on the 17th of March will include speakers on the role of the ESG in its wider role as well, with such areas as funeral directors, masons, florists, etc. And on a practical level, the Federation's Crematorium Compliance Inspection Scheme, where we visit up to 60 crematoria a year to inspect, is being extended to include a separate section which will produce an environmental awareness report for the member. Now, the environmental awareness report is based on 16 questions which cover 4 key areas, and I won't go into them all now, but they start with cremator operation, including the use of filtration to reduce emissions. Not only that included in the current process guidance, but also including Nox abatement. How the cremators are operated. Has a policy of holding over been adopted to enable several cremations to be carried out one after another to reduce both fuel usage and the production of CO2. It looks at grounds and environmental related initiatives, such as the use of chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. These are all things that we need to reduce. Is the cremation authority providing charging points in the car park? Are more areas being set aside for biodiversity? And considering as well the range of memorials provided to the crematorium, are ones which could be recycled? Are they included in the range we offer to the public? Of course, the organisational culture will be key to this change. So we look at that as well. Is the crematorium management open to change and adopting the environmental agenda, including replacing petrol and diesel equipment with electric powered tools? Has the crematorium adopted an environmental policy? And finally, energy usage. Has the building got an energy performance certificate? Is energy purchased from a green supplier? All these things will be considered, and the report will arrive at a score against a national average, which is based on the trial sites we have already visited. The purpose of this report is to inform and advise the individual member. It's not to be critical or look for fault. And the results will be anonymised and shared with the sector to help us all discover where we are on this journey to improved environmentalism. And the next slide, please, Scott. I mentioned environmental policy. So on a practical level, I think many large organisations, such as large cremation companies and also local authorities, adopt generic environmental policies, support members, adopt an environmental way of working. Well, from April, the Federation will launch a specific environmental policy statement for crematoria to adopt, and it focuses on the way crematoria work. The statement requires members to seek to adhere to a number of aims, including complying with environmental legislation and seeking continual improvement in environmental performance, operate processes in such a way as to minimise environmental impact, maximise the energy efficiency of crematoria and ancillary facilities, encourage employees at all levels within the organisation to take ownership for good environmental practice. Through regular meetings and good communication, encourage active participation with key stakeholders. Crematorium managers meeting with local funeral directors, memorial masons, florists, again to drive change at that very basic level, to drive change upwards. And also to nominate a named individual to champion environmental stewardship throughout the Cremation Authority, be responsible for environmental oversight. This is not an additional post, I must stress. We're not trying to add bureaucracy and costs. It's just a role that a person can have that we can all look to as a champion for the environment. All those attending the webinar will be sent a copy of the environmental policy statement. So if you have any questions or would like to be an early adopter, please don't hesitate to contact me. In conclusion, I should just like to take this opportunity to thank our partners, CDS Group, who've been incredibly supportive of the Federation in developing these environmental tools. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendon. Let's hear from David Collingwood and his thoughts from a funeral director's perspective.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Brendon, for that. Hope you can hear me okay. If we just move on to the next slide, please, Scott. I'm not an expert on the environment, and I just wanted to use today to present the funeral directors and the client's perspective and some of the challenges that we face. I think on average, a person arranges possibly 2 funerals in a lifetime. And so they're not experts. The people aren't experts on this. They're dealing with individual grief and sometimes don't see the collective benefit, I think, of the wider picture. The funeral director's role is to represent the interests of the family after a detailed discussion. But with many funerals, tradition is important to the client, to the family involved. There's a pressure on the person who's arranging the funeral to probably fulfill family wishes, a pressure to follow tradition and convention as well. And moving away from that sometimes can cause difficulty and challenge. I think the funeral director plays an important role in discussing the options available to the client following a discussion on the life and wishes of the deceased. So any changes that we want to make, I think it's really important to focus on the funeral industry and the funeral director to ensure that they understand and can articulate properly to families what the options are and what the benefits are. Because we know that choice and personalisation is becoming more important. And sometimes environmental concerns can take a secondary place to that. If we can just move on, thanks, Scott. So some of the issues, well, vehicles, for example, large engines predominantly in these vehicles, they're coach built, so they're effectively handmade by a small number of manufacturers. Demand isn't massive in the sector, so the opportunity for investment in research and development for new technologies with vehicles is really quite difficult for the coach builders. And as well, the way that funeral directors use their vehicles, you know, we're absolutely neurotic about making sure our vehicles are clean and, you know, absolutely showroom fresh for every funeral that we look after. So we do a lot of car cleaning and car polishing, and there's a consequent knock-on effect in terms of runoff and the chemicals that are used there. I think coffins and fittings and emissions it's a big subject. We've talked about nitrogen oxide and CO2, but emissions can also come from the deceased within the coffin as well, and that can be a factor. Care of the deceased, formaldehyde-based fluids that are used. This is formaldehyde in solution that's used in arterial fluids. We've talked about amalgam, mercury in teeth, the number of people who still have mercury in their teeth. Medical implants, modern medicine and treatments as well. And also then the care of the deceased with refrigeration, with temperature controlled units and the power that they use as well in terms of what's required. And looking at the funeral itself, for example, flowers available really all year round, but flowers from the Netherlands and the hothouses there, a huge amount of energy used, and also the transportation, across from the Netherlands to the UK and through the UK as well. The flower makeup as well, traditional flowers on funerals, the use of oasis, the sponge-like material that the flowers are pressed into, the flower stalks are pressed into, and the plastic trays that they sit in as well are things to think about. And of course, what most people on here will know is largely burial and cremation, and the energy that's used in terms of cremation and the land and the opportunities that's used in terms of burial and interments as well, the land use. And I think as well, some of the issues around, the headstone material that we use. Granite, dark grey and black granite is not native to the UK. It's shipped, as Brendan's mentioned, from China and India. The granites themselves that are available within the UK are really the lighter granites, the Cornish or the red granites, which are the sort of Scottish style granites. But the opportunity for quarrying and the opportunity for processing of those is limited in terms of supply. And I think there's an ethical issue as well with the supply of granite. Is the supply chain robust, not just to the point of manufacture and refining of the stone, but actually right the way back to the quarry face in these countries? Are we comfortable that child labour is not being used or effectively slave labour is not being used? So if we move on, Scott, thank you. So the context then. Tradition is still affects the majority of funerals, and there is inertia in some parts of the sector. Funeral directors who are reluctant to change, family members who are reluctant to change. There's no imperative for voluntary change. Change really only occurs where legislation requires it, and suppliers. Potentially suppliers themselves can actually start to say, look, what is the opportunity? What can we do? And I think that's already happening as well. Certainly amongst coffin manufacturers are now, largely using water-based lacquers and adhesives for the coffin construction. And I think there's an opportunity to do more there in terms of actually thinking about the construction, thinking about the things that a family wouldn't be affected by and wouldn't see and wouldn't be affected by that construction. I think as well, we're already seeing embalming chemical development as well, where the use of formaldehyde-free embalming fluids, there is a problem in that the preservation effect of the fluids is severely reduced, but there still is a presentation opportunity with good formaldehyde-free fluids that allow a family to see somebody in a very, very peaceful, natural position. I think as well, we're looking, the opportunity to look at, resumation, cremation, composting, the reuse of graves. Lots of new options there, but these things take a long time to normalise as well. Remember, cremation when it was introduced was seen as almost a barbaric, not that long ago, and it took some time for change to happen. I think as well, there's more use of standard vehicles in the ceremonial processes now. So families aren't requiring as many limousines because they have their own source of transport and they're prepared to use it. But we know that, from 2030, that, all new vehicles will need to be electric. And that could lead to the use of more European style standard hearses and executive saloons rather than the coach built vehicles. But, you know, UK manufacturers are looking at this now, and there are already 2 all-electric hearses available on the market, and also 2 hybrid versions, petrol hybrid versions as well. But it's complicated technology for coach builders to use. And remember, you know, the volumes are quite low in reality to normal car sales. So we could also then look at sources of energy for funeral homes and care centres that are used. Where do we get the electric from? Is it sustainable? Are we reinvesting that? And that's something, again, that the client just would not see and would not be affected by. We could look at regional, you know, seasonal flowers, for example, for the funeral, and finding now there's a trend for more families wishing just family flowers only, and wanting donations to go to charity. And the way to donate to charity is a lot slicker and a lot easier now. I think as well with memorials, encouraging the use of more native materials, and that could be through cemeteries and churchyards and burial grounds, actually saying these are the types of materials that we will permit, and potentially going through the pain of actually no longer allowing the use of, you know, some of the dark granites and the grey granites as well. And I think as well that there's an opportunity for market disruption. We're seeing that technology and online opportunities are coming into the funeral market, and in a sense, there's less societal compliance with families. I think people are actually starting to realise that they've got the permission to organise the funeral in the way that they want to. And we've seen with COVID as well that people's choices are changing, sometimes out of necessity in terms of the number of people attending the funeral, but also I think people are starting to look at things like direct cremation and having a celebration of a life afterwards, and, you know, in a sense challenging the tradition of, you know, following the body in and out of a building, following the body, you know, in a cortege, following and seeing the body at its final resting place, and actually saying, actually, that could all be done, and we could have a celebration of a life, a memorial service around the ashes instead, at a time and a date and a venue that's more suitable for us. So the market is changing in my view, but there is still a huge fight ahead, I think, in terms of changing people's mindset, especially at a time when it's my mum we're talking about here, and it's my mum's funeral that's important. So there's lots of questions, and I think very, very few answers. But I think for us, the challenge collectively is introduce change without impacting choice. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Now I'd like to introduce our final panellist of the day, who's going to take us through how Huntingdon Council are tackling the environmental agenda. Philip, over to you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Brendon and David, for your presentations. Some of what we're going to say will obviously cross over because we're all talking about the environment. Can I have the first slide, Scott, please? The first thing Huntingdon Town Council needed to do was identify the need. And initially, the first element of that was to get councillors to talk about death. It's not a natural subject for a town council to talk about, but our cemetery was getting to capacity, and we needed to look for a new area of land to accommodate new burials. Whilst looking at that, we realised there was a need for a crematorium for the distance residents of Huntingdon and the local area had to travel. Became intensively more difficult and time consuming. We then engaged a CDS group, Justin and Becky. They helped us to identify that need, and they've taken us through this whole process. We've worked very closely with them, to which we're most thankful. In addition, the town council had to look at the rest of its portfolio of what it had to do, and we realised we needed a new depot for our equipment, a new glasshouse. We were using just domestic glass houses, which were not efficient. All of this had to fit in with the environmental agenda. Next slide, please. So the environmental agenda. We're starting from a clean sheet. We've got no experience of crematoriums. We are the first town parish council in the country to build one. And so it gave us the opportunity to challenge existing practices. As Brendon's slide showed, challenge, change, shake up, and disrupt. I don't think we're there to disrupt. We're there to challenge, we're there to change, and there may be a shake-up along the route, which we will be helping and supporting. We're looking for the new alternatives, not the traditional routes, not the traditional headstones, not the traditional coffins. And we want to harness technology. Next slide, please. Our new cemetery will have 2,000 burial plots, which will see us well into the future. This site will accommodate all faiths and none. We do not discriminate against anybody who wishes to be buried in our cemeteries. Our own team dig the graves, and we are also now looking, whilst we use a diesel-powered digger, we're now looking to exchange that in for an electric battery-powered digger. Our crematorium is going to be run using green electricity, and we are having installed 2 DFW electric cremators. Rainwater harvesting will be a key element on the site, and waste heat will be harnessed to use within the buildings. Electric car points, charging points, are already installed in the car park. So anybody coming to a service at the site or visiting a grave can charge their car up whilst they're on site. And when electric hearse become available, again, that facility will be available. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges we've looked at and the way we're going forward. As I've mentioned, green electricity, very important to us that the whole site is serviced by green electricity. Coffins. Why are we allowing chipboard and plywood coffins, which are filled with toxic glues? Why do we allow coffins to be covered in glitter? If we bury them, they get into the watercourse. Or if we burn them, they get into the air. Ashes. Why are we putting them in plastic containers? There will be no plastic containers at Huntingdon Crematorium. They will be the ashes will be put into biodegradable bags and into cardboard containers, which are all degradable. Flowers, mentioned by both Brendon and David. Flowers are flown in not just from Holland, all across the world. This last weekend was Valentine's Day. Most of the roses which came into this country came from Colombia. We've got growers in this country. We need to promote through the florists the use of local flowers, seasonal flowers, plastic frames to put the flowers in. What are we going to do with them? Should we be sending them back to the undertaker? Should we be sending them back to the florist to reuse? The floral foam in there, it takes 10 years to decompose, and then it still puts plastics in the watercourse. Even the environmentally friendly floral foam takes 2 years at least to biodegrade. We need to encourage florists to go back to the basics of floristry. Memorials. There's been quite a lot said today about granite headstones coming in from India and China. There is other stone available in this country. You don't just have to have granite. Wood is also a very useful medium for a headstone or memorial plaque. More environmentally friendly, more sustainable. We must encourage more use of locally produced wood and stone to protect British jobs and encourage more people into that trade. Embalming, I still question, why do we do it? Why do we put chemicals in the ground or into our cremators? We are looking to introduce a carbon tax. Anybody wishing to use a coffin made of chipboard, anybody wishing to put a memorial headstone made of granite, we will be imposing a carbon tax upon that. That carbon tax will then be used to fund more environmental projects like tree planting, etc. Final slide, please, Scott. The other element we'll be building on our site is our new depot and glass house, which will be at the back of our crematorium. The depot will be heated by an air source heat pump. It will have solar panels on the roof to generate power to charge battery operated tools, our mowers, our strimmers, hedge cutters, etc. All of the floral displays, tributes will be composted. We have a commercial composter. The compost will then be used either on the flower beds, in tubs and containers to enhance what's on the site. It will remain on the site and be reused. As I've mentioned, rainwater harvesting, important. The plants in our greenhouse will be watered by the rainwater which we've harvested. And of the greenhouse, between 30 and 50% of the heat harvested from the cremators will be used to heat that greenhouse. And we will then be setting up our own tree nursery to grow our own trees from seedlings or from cuttings so that we can produce everything the town needs from one site. Thank you.
Thanks, panel, for your presentations. You know, I think it's been very interesting and very insightful to see how each of the different areas are tackling the environmental challenge. We do have some questions in from the audience, so we've got a little bit of time left now, so let me just kind of quickly rattle through these. Anything that we don't answer today, we will answer as part of the follow-up after the event. So where we distribute the webinar, we will actually send answers to those questions where we haven't been able to answer them live today. So first, David, you mentioned tradition typically determines choice when it comes to the service and products. With the rise of direct simple cremations, 140,000, which is 20% of the market, should it be compulsory to use an eco coffin for these ceremonies? Surely this would dramatically decrease the CO2 and NOx produced.
I think any coffin used for cremation, whether it's a direct cremation or a simple attended service, I think any coffin, you know, we've got to look at the makeup of those coffins and seeing how can they best be improved. I think there's more work that can be done. I think manufacturers are working hard at this, but I think there is more work that can be done. But I would say that it should be overall all coffins used for cremation, because I don't want to limit the choice of a family who are having just a simple attended service if they're, you know, wanting a particular style of coffin. I think all coffins we need to think about actually when they're cremated, and you know, the deceased inside as well. Actually, how do we reduce and control the emissions that are given off?
Thank you, David. Okay, question from Brent Stevenson. Will all parts of the bereavement sector be independently evaluated to quantify the environmental impact rather than guesswork? And if so, who will carry this out and how will it be financed? I guess that's you, Brendon.
Thanks for that, Scott. Yeah, I think that's an incredibly fair point, and I agree with it entirely. As the Federation, you know, we represent the owners and operators of crematoria, and we need to be able to operate and make decisions based on scientific evidence. We all have our own views regarding the environment, but we can't operate businesses in that way. So I say with the environmental awareness report, to begin with, certainly this first year, it's going to be about gathering those results and seeing what they tell us and sharing them with other organisations in the sector, and hopefully getting them analysed by people at universities and getting their answers, because you know, Brent's quite right, we can't sort of go forward based on people's thoughts and feelings. I'm certainly not an expert on the environment and on emissions and everything else. I look to other people for those answers. And I think as a sector, we need to do the same thing. And just picking up on what Philip and David said on the Oasis, I think I'm right in saying the Royal Horticultural Society have now banned Oasis from any of their shows. So again, now this is something where we need to look out with our partners, the florists. And again, it's not a matter of, you know, being critical towards them or trying to stop their business. It's just a matter of introducing change that we can all live with.
Okay, thank you, Brendon. There's a question here for Philip. Philip, did you consider resummation for your project?
Yes, we did. As I opened, the first step was to get councillors to talk about death. And whilst we managed to get them to talk about burials and recognise cremations, to go those further steps, it was a step too far for them to digest and take on. So at this particular stage, going electric was as far as they would go. They are aware, and they also looked at the composting, but they just felt it was too radical at this stage, and they recognised it will come in the future. But we're just going to be at the front of what we knew was available now.
Thanks, Philip. And that leads into another question we've got here, which is, with reference to alternatives to cremation, are there any plans to raise awareness and educate in a more public setting to increase a better understanding?
Should I pick that one up, Scott?
I think that's probably you, Brendon, yeah.
I would say I don't think it's the Federation's role to inform the public. We certainly inform our members of these developments, and again through the inspections we will be doing in the areas we'll be looking at, we will be looking to see members informing the public of alternatives. And I think there's a real role here for the Cremation Society and in the Environmental Stewardship Group, who will see that sort of bigger picture, especially the Cremation Society, who are an educational charity. I think they can have a really important role in this area.
Brilliant. Thank you. We've still got lots and lots of questions here, and I'm very conscious of time. So I'm going to go with one more question, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. We will answer all the other questions. We'll go through them and answer them later for everybody, and share that with the webinar recording. Last question for today is, and I guess this is probably more aimed at Philip in terms of information. How long will the biodegradable bags used for ashes at Huntingdon last for if kept dry? For example, will families still be able to store them for as long as they wish, or will they need to transfer to a new container if they want to store them long term?
Very good question. Obviously, we haven't been able to put that to the test yet because we only open at the end of April. And a quick plug, if anybody wants to visit us after that date, you're more than welcome to do so. The time for the bag to biodegrade is how it is exposed. If most plastics degrade subject to light, if it's kept in a container, which they will be in a cardboard container, they will last much longer. Most families, I've learned, do tend to take them even out of the plastic containers that they're presented with and put them in their own urn or box. So we don't anticipate the need for them to be a long-lasting bag. That's our answer to that one. But until we've tested it, I can't give you exact timescales.
Okay.
It's a
Thank you very much, Carl.
It's a short-term storage, isn't it, Philip, to transport the ashes to their final destination, which, you know, an incredible amount of plastic is used at the moment.
Yes, that's what we're trying to cut down, the use of plastics.
Once again, thanks, guys. As I say, I'm conscious of the time. We're pretty much at the end of our session for today. So thank you all for joining us for today's event. I hope you found the session beneficial. Please take a look at the OpusXenta website blog section, where you'll find several informative articles, as well as a series of events and seminars, webinars that we'll be running. You can see the next 3 scheduled here. And as Brendon's already mentioned, the next one for the climate emergency is on the 17th of March. We'll
just on that very quickly, sorry to interrupt, just on that very quickly, for anyone who's interested, I've just copied and pasted the registration link straight to the webinar on the 17th. So if anybody did want to register for it, it's there in the chat for ease of reference.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks, Jen. So we will distribute the recordings of today's session, so please feel free to share those with your colleagues. And once again, thank you for your time today.